What if the life you thought was built on faith was actually built on lies? What if every rule, every sermon, every carefully chosen word was designed not to protect, but to hide? That's the question that has haunted fans of Welcome to Plathville as we've watched the family's story twist and fracture right before our eyes. For years, the Plaths sold America a picture of purity. A Christian family living off the land in rural Georgia, raising 9 children away from worldly influence. No TV, no internet, no sugar, no dating, just God, family, and farm life. They looked like the kind of family that belonged in a painting. Smiling kids, matching clothes, golden sunlight, and a mother who seemed to hold it all together. Kim Plath was the center of it all. She spoke with calm authority, taught her kids music, led family prayers, and made the audience believe that everything she did came from love and conviction. And beside her stood Barry, the quiet, steady husband. Together they appeared unshakable, united by faith and purpose. But the longer viewers watched, the more the cracks began to show. Hi friends, I'm Sarah, and welcome back to Sister Wives Chapter. If you love real emotional storytelling and honest commentary about the families you thought you knew, make sure you subscribe right now and let me know your thoughts in the comments. Because what we're about to discuss might change the way you see the Plath family forever. In the early seasons, Welcome to Plathville introduced us to a world that felt almost frozen in time. The Plath kids were polite, quiet, and obedient. They didn't go to public school. They didn't drink soda. They didn't even know who modern musicians were. It was extreme by any standard, but Kim and Barry insisted they were simply protecting their children from corruption. They claimed this was how you raise pure souls in a dark world. Viewers at first accepted that. Many even admired them. But when we started to hear the kids speak, something shifted. Mariah, the bold and emotional daughter, started questioning why she wasn't allowed to wear what she wanted. Ethan, the eldest son, began to push back after marrying Olivia, who challenged the family's strict beliefs. The cracks widened with every episode. The control that once looked like structure began to look like fear. Kim's constant insistence on doing what's right suddenly seemed less about faith and more about control. Even Barry, the man who'd always stood quietly behind her, began to show discomfort. You could see it in the way he avoided confrontation, in how he looked away when Kim spoke over the children. The more freedom his kids wanted, the tighter Kim held on. And that's where things start to feel unsettling. Because it wasn't just about rules anymore. It was about power. As fans, we all watched the story evolve. Kim went from being the spiritual center of the family to something else entirely. She opened a dance studio, started dressing differently, and began talking about rediscovering herself. It was like watching someone walk out of their own life. And while everyone around her was confused, Kim was calm. Too calm. Even Barry admitted he didn't understand what was happening. After more than 20 years of marriage, he was watching his wife turn into a stranger. One moment she was preaching about modesty and faith, and the next she was talking about finding freedom. The children could sense it too. Mariah's frustration turned to anger. Ethan pulled further away. Even Lydia, the most obedient of all, seemed heartbroken trying to hold the family together. The shift was so sudden that fans began to ask, what caused it? What could make Kim Plath walk away from the world she built so carefully? If you go back and watch those moments again, you'll notice the way Kim's voice changes when she talks about the past. She becomes defensive, guarded, like she's hiding something that she doesn't want to say out loud. When Barry tries to talk about saving the marriage, she cuts him off, saying things like, I need to focus on me, or I've lost myself. And yet, it always feels like there's more behind those words. Barry's face says it all. He looks shocked, humiliated, broken. In interviews, he admits he never saw it coming. He says Kim simply drifted away and didn't want to come back. You can feel his confusion, but you can also sense his fear, like he's realizing the woman beside him had been building her own life in secret long before she ever left. There's a reason fans say this. Family's story feels like watching a mask slowly crack. Because for years, Kim was the mask. When you think about how controlled the children's lives were, it's hard not to wonder what Kim was trying to protect herself from. Was it the outside world, or was it her own past? She claimed she wanted her kids to stay pure, but purity can't exist when it's built on lies. By the time she and Barry officially separated, that picture-perfect image of the Plaths had completely fallen apart. Kim was living her own life. The kids were scattered. Mariah chasing music, Micah modeling, Ethan and Olivia trying to rebuild trust in their own marriage. The once unified family had become a collection of people trying to find themselves after years of control. Even the tone of the show changed. What started as a wholesome family program turned into a slow-motion heartbreak. Viewers who once admired Kim began questioning her motives. Why the sudden obsession with self-liberation? Why the coldness toward Barry? And why did it feel like she was rewriting the family's history to make herself look innocent? Kim started talking about how unhappy she'd been, how she'd sacrificed everything for her family. But those statements didn't match what we'd seen for years. She wasn't miserable before, she was in control. She made the rules, she shaped the world, she decided who was allowed to think differently. So what changed? What was powerful enough to make Kim abandon the narrative she'd defended for 2 decades? Maybe it wasn't change at all. Maybe it was exposure. Because once you start rewatching the early episodes, you see patterns that don't add up. A woman who avoids questions about her own childhood. A mother who micromanages her children's emotions. A family that isolates itself not just for faith, but for secrecy. That's the uncomfortable question Welcome to Plathville has forced us to ask. What if this family wasn't built to protect the kids, but to protect Kim? And as the later seasons unfold, pieces of her past begin surfacing. Not gossip, not tabloid rumors, real questions about who Kim was before she met Barry. The image of a loving, devoted mother begins to clash with the possibility of a woman who has been hiding a second life. Even the Plath kids start sensing it. You can see it in their tone when they talk about her. Mariah calls her manipulative. Ethan says he doesn't know who his mother is anymore. Micah keeps his distance, saying he's focusing on his own peace. The trust is gone, replaced by quiet suspicion. And that's where our story begins. Not with faith, but with doubt. Not with devotion, but with discovery. Because somewhere between the family's first episode and Kim's sudden transformation, something happened. Something that made her rewrite her identity, control everyone around her, and then walk away when the truth got too close. The world saw a godly mother. The kids saw a woman losing control. And now, it seems, the truth about Kim Plath might finally be catching up with her. Whatever Kim has been running from, it's starting to surface. And the evidence may prove she was never who she claimed to be. What if the perfect Christian family wasn't perfect at all, just perfectly controlled? In the early years of Welcome to Plathville, the Plath seemed like a throwback to another century. 9 children, homeschooled, barefoot in the Georgia sun, playing instruments and smiling sweetly for the cameras. But behind those smiles was a system, an airtight world designed and maintained by Kim Plath. Kim was not just the mother. She was the architect. Every decision, every rule, every belief in that house passed through her filter. And Barry, her quiet, soft-spoken husband, followed. The Plath children weren't just sheltered. They were cut off. No sugar, no soda, no television, no social media, no outside friends. Their world was built around purity, control, and Kim's interpretation of faith. Even their access to music, ironically, the one thing that brought them joy, was regulated. When fans first met the family, it seemed wholesome. Kim would beam with pride as she described raising pure children. But as the seasons unfolded, the cracks widened. The smiles didn't reach the eyes anymore. The kids began to shift in their seats when Kim spoke. Mariah, the wild spirit of the family, became the first to visibly push back. She wanted freedom, music, a little makeup, jeans that weren't handmade, things most teenage girls take for granted. But in the Plath house, independence was rebellion. We watched the tension rise on screen. Mariah's voice quivering as she said she just wanted to be herself. Kim's eyes, cold and unwavering, replying that Mariah was being influenced by the world. Ethan, the eldest son, had it worse in some ways. Raised to be the golden boy, he followed every rule, every word. But when he married Olivia, an outsider with her own ideas of faith and freedom, his loyalty was torn in two. The conflict between Kim and Olivia became one of the most uncomfortable dynamics in reality TV history. Olivia tried to bring light into Ethan's world, introducing him to music, travel, and normalcy. But to Kim, that was corruption. She drew an invisible wall, one Ethan couldn't cross without betraying his family. Fans saw it all. Ethan crying in interviews, Mariah breaking down, Olivia trying to set boundaries while Kim subtly manipulated the narrative. Sarah's voice softens here, emotional yet deliberate. When you look back at those early seasons, it's chilling. Kim called it faith, but it looked like fear. Every boundary she set, every rule she made, it wasn't protecting her kids. It was isolating them. Kim spoke often about purity, modesty, and obedience, but those ideals seemed to serve her more than her children. She dictated what they wore, what they ate, what music they heard, and even what emotions they were allowed to express. There were moments, small, fleeting, where the children's exhaustion peeked through. Micah's quiet defiance, Lydia's desperate desire to please her mother, Mariah's eyes filling with tears as she said she felt like the problem child. And through it all, Barry stood in the background, smiling politely, rarely contradicting Kim. Fans wondered, was he complicit, or was he under control too? The Plath home became its own ecosystem. Kim taught the children that the outside world was dangerous, that worldly people would lead them astray. But in doing so, she built a fortress of fear. Sarah continues in a more reflective tone. It's something we've seen before, right? A parent claiming to protect their family when really they're protecting their own image. Kim wanted control because control meant safety. And maybe deep down, she was terrified of what would happen if the truth ever got out. Kim's control was absolute, but fragile. You could sense it every time one of the kids asked a question that made her uncomfortable. The way her smile tightened. The way she'd shift the conversation. Mariah once asked, "Why can't I have friends outside the family?" Kim replied that the world didn't share their values. But that answer didn't satisfy her anymore. You could see the spark in Mariah's eyes, the same spark that would eventually ignite the rebellion that changed everything. And Ethan, so loyal, so obedient, began to change too. His relationship with Olivia forced him to confront everything he'd been taught. He started to see that his life had been scripted. Olivia once said on camera, "They live in fear of disappointing Kim." And that single sentence summed up everything. Sarah's tone sharpens. When love comes with conditions, it stops being love. It becomes control. And Kim's control was so total that even the adults in her life, Barry included, stopped questioning it. Retention line. Something about Kim's rules never made sense. And soon, her own children would start asking why. You could feel it, season after season, the shift. The kids were growing up. The questions were getting harder to silence. And for the first time, the perfect picture Kim had painted began to blur. There was a dinner scene, quiet, almost mundane, where Barry looked across the table at his wife as the children's voices filled the background. His face said everything. For years, he'd gone along with her structure, her system. But now, with his family starting to crumble, you could see it in his eyes. Doubt. Sarah leans into the mic, her tone low. Deliberate. That's the thing about control. It feels powerful until the moment it starts to break. And when it does, it takes everything with it. Kim had built her identity on being the righteous mother, the one who held the family together through faith and discipline. But behind closed doors, her children were slipping away. One by one, they were waking up. Mariah moved out. Micah found modeling. Ethan stopped answering his parents' calls. And Barry started to ask his own questions. He'd been the quiet one, the one who believed keeping peace meant keeping still. But when Kim's behavior started to change, her new independence, her secretive attitude, her sudden distance, Barry couldn't ignore it anymore. Was her need for control a mask for guilt, fear, or something she didn't want anyone to discover? Sarah pauses. Even Barry, after 25 years of obedience, was finally wondering if the life he'd built with Kim was real, or just another rule in her book. The camera fades to black on that thought, because for the first time, the man who'd stood beside Kim in silence was about to start looking for answers, and what he would find would change everything. It started quietly. A new haircut, a different wardrobe, a smile that felt just a little too practiced. Kim, Plath, once the image of modesty and obedience to her own rigid code, was changing before everyone's eyes. This was the same woman who once told her daughters to cover their shoulders, who lectured about temptation, who preached that the body is a temple. And suddenly, that same woman was dancing, literally dancing in front of cameras, laughing in tight jeans and talking about finding herself. To the public, it looked like a midlife awakening. A woman stepping out of repression, empowerment, freedom. But to her family, it looked like betrayal. Sarah's voice breaks through the narrative, steady, empathetic, and laced with disbelief. Imagine growing up under rules so strict you couldn't drink a soda or text your friends, and then watching your mother, the woman who made those rules, throw them away overnight. That's not awakening, that's whiplash. Kim's transformation stunned the Plath kids. Her dance studio, her new confidence, her separation from Barry, all of it hit like a tidal wave. The early seasons had built her up as the moral compass of the family, the unshakable matriarch who said she'd never compromise her faith. But suddenly, she was redefining everything she'd once stood for. Fans began noticing the contradictions. The same woman who said TV and music would corrupt the soul was now embracing social media, sharing quotes about self-discovery and independence. And Barry was left in the ruins of the world they had built together. We watched it unfold on screen, his eyes red-rimmed, his voice trembling, saying he'd been blindsided. In one heartbreaking confessional, Barry admitted, "I thought we were doing okay. I didn't see this coming." That moment hit like a punch, because for the first time, the quiet, compliant husband seemed genuinely lost. The man who had once defended Kim's every decision was now trying to make sense of her sudden disappearance, from their marriage, from the home, from the very ideals they'd shared for decades. Sarah's commentary cuts through softly. It's easy to label Kim's change as empowerment. But when you look at the damage left behind, the confusion, the pain, it feels less like growth and more like escape. For years, Kim had lived by extremes. Total control or total collapse. And when her world started slipping, she didn't loosen her grip. She dropped it entirely. She told the cameras she was learning who she really was. But what does that mean when your identity has always depended on controlling others? Kim started spending time away from the farm. The once bustling Plath home became eerily quiet. Barry still tended the land, but the life that had filled it was gone. Mariah stopped visiting. Ethan kept his distance. Lydia tried to stay loyal to both sides but couldn't hold the crumbling bridge together. There's a haunting scene from that season. Barry standing in the living room, surrounded by empty chairs. He looks down and says softly, "It's just me now." The tone of the entire show shifted. The family that once sang hymns together was now scattered across states, connected only by confusion and resentment. And through it all, Kim seemed unaffected, calm, detached, almost rehearsed. She started using words like healing, growth, and boundaries. But for the kids, those words didn't feel healing at all. They felt hollow. Sarah's voice sharpens, emotional yet analytical. When someone who's caused deep pain suddenly starts talking about healing, it's not always about making peace. Sometimes it's about rewriting the story. Fans debated endlessly online. Was Kim finally freeing herself from an oppressive system, or was she the one who built it all along? Even the audience was torn. Some saw her as brave. Others saw hypocrisy. But what everyone agreed on was this. Nothing about her change made sense. She hadn't just left her marriage. She'd left the entire identity she forced onto her family. Retention line. Kim said she was finding herself, but maybe she was running from something instead. It's the question that hung in every episode, every interview, every fan forum. Why now? After decades of strictness, judgment, and control, why did Kim suddenly decide to live a different life? Barry's confusion deepened as she began physically and emotionally detaching. She stopped wearing her wedding ring. She stopped mentioning faith. She talked about wanting to reconnect with herself. Sarah narrates with a touch of sorrow. You could see it in Barry's face. He was still trying to fight for the marriage, while Kim had already left it. The camera caught moments that spoke volumes. Barry reaching out during a conversation, Kim leaning back. Barry suggesting counseling, Kim saying she needed space. He told producers, "I thought marriage was forever. I guess we see that differently now." The emotional weight of that single line encapsulated the entire season, because for Barry, everything had been about unity, family, and stability. For Kim, suddenly, it was about freedom. Freedom she'd never allowed anyone else to have. Sarah's tone hardens. How do you teach your kids to obey, to sacrifice, to suppress themselves, and then decide you're the only one allowed to be free? It was more than a midlife crisis. It was a pattern: control, collapse, and reinvention. The same cycle that had kept her family under her thumb was now turning inward. Kim began presenting her new life like a fresh chapter, smiling, glowing, carefree. But in her children's eyes, she'd become unrecognizable. Mariah said in one interview, "I don't know who my mom is anymore. That wasn't rebellion. That was grief." The Plath kids weren't just losing their mother. They were realizing they never truly knew her. Even Lydia, who had always defended Kim, began hesitating when asked about the situation. She said softly, "I just want peace." Peace. Something no one in that family had truly experienced. Sarah's voice deepens, almost whispering, it's the cruelest irony. Kim built a world where no one could question her. But once her children started finding their voices, she vanished. It's as if the version of Kim they knew couldn't exist in a world where she wasn't in control. Fans started speculating online that there had to be more, something deeper driving her transformation. Old acquaintances, former church members, even distant relatives began hinting that Kim's story wasn't as spotless as it seemed. Suddenly, the whispers turned into questions, and the questions into quiet alarm. Was this change really about self-discovery? Or was it about hiding something that was about to surface? Barry's demeanor changed too. Gone was the man who once smiled through every storm. His tone hardened, his eyes sharper, as if he'd begun piecing together a truth he'd ignored for years. The final scenes of that season showed him in quiet reflection, saying, "You think you know someone after 25 years. But I guess we all have sides we don't show." Sarah pauses for dramatic effect, her tone lowering into a chilling whisper. And that's when everything shifted. Because as Kim tried to move on, the past she buried began clawing its way back to the surface. The dance studio, the independence, the perfect new image. It wasn't freedom. It was a cover, and soon, her own family would uncover what she'd been hiding all along. When Kim walked away from her family, she didn't just leave behind a husband and 9 children. She left behind confusion, silence, and questions that refused to die. For months, Barry tried to keep things stable. He smiled on camera, tended to the property, and spoke softly about working through things. But behind that calm exterior was a man standing in the wreckage of a life he no longer understood. Sarah's voice carries a slow, deliberate weight. When you spend 25 years building a life around one person, you think you know them. You think every smile, every prayer, every rule means something. But what happens when the person you built your life around starts to look like a stranger? The cameras caught it all. The quiet dinners, the awkward pauses, the children's hesitant questions that never quite got answered. Mariah's anger simmered beneath every word she spoke. She'd once been the one who challenged Kim, who broke free first, but she didn't want this kind of freedom. "Not like this," she said in one confessional. "I thought she wanted to fix things, but she just disappeared." Ethan, usually quiet and private, shut down completely. His marriage to Olivia was already strained, but this new wave of family turmoil pushed him further into silence. Olivia tried to help him process the chaos, but her patience was fading. In one scene, she said bluntly, "Your mom's story keeps changing. Don't you think that's strange?" And that's when the questions began to turn into suspicion. There was something about Kim's transformation that didn't add up. The timeline, the sudden shifts, the way she avoided specifics whenever anyone asked what had changed. Barry, ever the rational one, tried to explain it away. "She just needs space," he'd tell the kids. "She's figuring things out." But even he didn't sound convinced anymore. Then came the moment that changed everything. Sarah's voice drops lower, the rhythm tightening like a suspense thriller. It started with a box, a simple forgotten box. Lydia had been cleaning one of the storage closets when she found it, an old cardboard box tucked behind stacks of photo albums and homeschooling materials. Dust-covered, unmarked. The kind of box that doesn't want to be found. Inside were old photographs, letters, and church documents, pieces of Kim's past from before she became Kim Plath, the matriarch. There were photos of her in places the kids had never seen, with people they didn't recognize. A young Kim, smiling, free, wild-eyed in a way that didn't match the strict mother they'd grown up with. And there were letters, handwritten, folded neatly, addressed to names no one in the family knew. Mariah flipped through them, confused. Ethan stayed silent, scanning the papers. Lydia, sweet and loyal, whispered, "Maybe this isn't what it looks like." But deep down, they all knew. Something about their mother's story didn't fit. Sarah's tone sharpens, emotional and piercing. This wasn't about old memories. This was about lies that had been buried long before the cameras ever rolled. As the kids shared what they found, the energy in the house shifted. Barry listened quietly, his face unreadable. But his silence wasn't denial, it was devastation. Because every photograph, every letter, every clue suggested one thing: that Kim's version of her own past was incomplete. Maybe even rewritten. Fans watching the season could feel the unease building like thunder in the background. The once pristine family narrative was unraveling piece by piece. Mariah's heartbreak turned to fury. "She made us believe we had to be perfect," she cried during a confessional. And she's been lying this whole time? Ethan refused to discuss it on camera, walking away mid-scene, while Olivia muttered under her breath, "Now it makes sense." Barry sat down with Lydia later that evening, his voice trembling. "Maybe your mom was trying to protect you," he said quietly. "Or maybe she was protecting herself." Sarah's commentary cuts in with empathy but edge. That's the thing about secrets. They always start with good intentions, but they end in destruction. Retention line. The family thought they were healing, but instead, they stumbled upon proof that shattered everything. The next few weeks were chaos. The kids began connecting the dots. Old acquaintances reached out. Stories surfaced about a younger Kim who had once lived a very different life. One not built on purity, modesty, or submission, but on ambition, rebellion, and mistakes she'd spent decades trying to erase. And suddenly, her need for control made sense. The strictness, the fear, the obsession with image. It wasn't just religion. It was guilt. Kim had built the Plath world as a kind of penance. A fortress where she could hide from the version of herself she didn't want to remember. Sarah's tone grows emotional, her voice breaking slightly. She wasn't just protecting her children from the world. She was protecting the world from her past. That realization broke something in Barry. The man who had defended her, followed her, trusted her with his soul, now faced the possibility that the woman he'd loved had been lying to him for years. On screen, Barry's calm demeanor faltered. His eyes welled up as he said softly, "I thought I knew everything about her. I guess I didn't." Meanwhile, Kim remained silent. No denial, no explanation, just distance. Producers reached out for interviews, but she avoided most questions, deflecting with phrases like, "That's between me and God." But the silence only fueled the speculation. Online forums buzzed with theories. Viewers compared old footage, analyzing inconsistencies in Kim's stories. Everything, from her past relationships to her early years, became suspect. And within the family, the emotional fallout was brutal. Mariah stopped answering her mother's texts. Ethan's visits home became rare. Lydia cried, torn between her love for her mother and the growing realization that love had been built on half-truths. Barry started spending more time away from the house. The land felt heavier now, the home emptier. The echo of what used to be perfect was unbearable. Sarah's tone turns haunting, the pacing deliberate. You could almost feel it, the moment when love turns into disbelief. When faith turns into doubt. When a family stops praying for answers and starts looking for evidence. Because that's what they had now. Evidence. Proof. And once you have proof, you can't unsee it. The Plath children, who had once been united in pain, were now divided by truth. Some wanted to forgive, some wanted to confront, But all of them were haunted by one question. What else had Kim been hiding? Sarah leans in, whispering as if to the audience directly. And that's when the family made a decision. They weren't going to live under silence anymore. Barry, Mariah, and Ethan agreed. Whatever the truth was, it needed to come out. Not on TV, not in interviews, but face to face. The stage was set for something the Plaths had never done before, an open confrontation, no rules. No cameras to hide behind, no script to control the narrative. Sarah's voice lowers, calm but heavy with foreboding. For 25 years, Kim controlled every conversation. But this time, she would be the one answering the questions. The family gathered what they'd found, the photos, the letters, the proof that had upended everything, and prepared for the conversation that could destroy what little piece remained. Barry's final words in the episode were simple but chilling. He looked into the camera and said, "I just want the truth. I think we all deserve that." And as the screen faded to black, the question lingered. Would Kim finally tell the truth? Or would she let the image she built crumble around her, just to keep her secrets buried? There's a certain silence that only comes before a storm. That stillness when everyone knows what's about to happen, but no one dares speak first. That's what the Plath house felt like when the confrontation finally came. After months of tension, whispers, and unanswered questions, Barry and the kids could no longer ignore the truth. The evidence they'd found had turned from curiosity into confrontation, and the person they once saw as their moral center was now the one being questioned. Kim had returned to the house that afternoon, calm and poised as always, her expression unreadable. She smiled politely when Barry opened the door, as if she was visiting, not coming home. Mariah stood near the window, arms crossed, while Ethan and Lydia sat across the room. It wasn't a family reunion. It was an intervention. Sarah's voice slows, letting each word sink in. This wasn't about rebellion. This was about truth. About children who had spent their entire lives living under control, now standing together to ask their mother who she really was. Barry started softly, his voice breaking with both sadness and restraint. "Kim, the kids found some things," he said. "Old letters, pictures, they need to understand." Kim didn't flinch. She sat down, folded her hands, and smiled faintly. "Those are from a long time ago. They don't mean anything now." But they did. They meant everything. Ethan, who had stayed silent through most of the family's unraveling, spoke first. "You told us everything in your life was built on faith. You said God led you here, but these letters, these people, why didn't you ever tell us about them?" Kim looked at him, and for a second there was a flicker, not of guilt, but of calculation. "Ethan, you don't understand what life was like before you were born. I was trying to protect you." Sarah's commentary cuts in, her tone sharp with disbelief. "Protect them? From what, the truth? From knowing their mother had a past that didn't fit the story she built?" Mariah couldn't hold back. She stood up, eyes wet but fiery. "You controlled everything we did. Everything we said. You told me I was worldly for wearing jeans, but you were living a lie the whole time." Kim's smile tightened. "You wouldn't understand the choices I had to make." Barry's head dropped. That was the moment he realized. She wasn't going to admit anything. Not yet. The tension in that room could be felt through the screen. Viewers watching the episode later would flood social media with comments like, "Finally. The kids are asking the real questions, and Kim can't keep dodging this forever." Retention line. For the first time, Kim wasn't in control. Her family was demanding the truth. Barry, ever the steady presence, spoke next. His voice was calm, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. "Kim, I supported you for 25 years. I believed everything you told me. But if there's something we don't know, we deserve honesty. Kim's eyes softened for a moment, but then she deflected again. I've already answered your questions, Barry. You're reading too much into things. That denial hit him harder than any confession could have. Sarah's voice grows quieter, more emotional. You could see it on his face. That moment when a man realizes he's been living in someone else's version of the truth. That the home he built, the rules he enforced, were never his. They were hers. Kim tried to steer the conversation away, talking about faith, about how the world didn't understand their family. But her words no longer carried the power they once did. The children didn't back down. Lydia, through tears, asked softly, Mom, did you lie to us? Kim hesitated. The cameras caught her inhale, the pause before she answered, but the words never came. Instead, she stood up, pacing, muttering about how everyone was turning against her. Barry reached out a hand, quietly saying, No one's against you. Kim, we just want the truth. But the truth, it seemed, was the one thing Kim couldn't give. Sarah speaks directly to the viewers now, her tone filled with both empathy and urgency. This family was built on control, strict rules, isolation, obedience. But the second they asked questions, the control slipped. Because truth doesn't live in silence. It lives in confrontation. The next few days after that meeting were unbearable. Barry retreated into reflection, replaying years of memories through a different lens. Every moment that once felt righteous now seemed heavy with manipulation. Every rule now looked like a defense mechanism. In one of his most heartfelt interviews, Barry said, I always thought we were doing the right thing. But maybe we were doing what Kim needed to feel safe. That line broke fans' hearts, because it wasn't said with bitterness. It was said with realization. Meanwhile, Mariah's anger boiled over. In her confessional, she said, My mom wants to be free now, but she took away everyone else's freedom first. Ethan, quieter but visibly hurt, added, You can't control people your whole life and then expect them to forgive you overnight. Kim stayed silent on social media. She avoided interviews, skipped family gatherings, and let speculation grow, and that silence became its own kind of confession. Sarah's tone shifts, slow, suspenseful. Sometimes the most powerful admission isn't what someone says. It's what they refuse to say. By this point, Barry had emotionally separated from her completely. He spoke about forgiveness, but it sounded more like farewell. In one heartbreaking scene, Barry sits outside the house at sunset, saying softly, I think she's gone for good. Not just physically, but emotionally. The person I married doesn't exist anymore. That line struck like lightning. Kim's identity, once the foundation of their family, now hung in question. Who was she before she was Kim Plath, wife and mother of 9? What was she running from? Sarah's voice builds the tension. Every story has two sides. But in this case, only one side is willing to speak. The other is still hiding behind the image she built. The emotional divide in the family widened. Lydia prayed for peace, Mariah demanded answers, Ethan distanced himself entirely, and Barry tried to hold what was left together. But deep down, they all knew this wasn't just about a marriage falling apart. It was about identity. About realizing their entire family story had been filtered through one person's fear and control. Kim had been the architect of everything. The house, the rules, the faith, the image. And now, piece by piece, it was collapsing. Sarah pauses, then adds gently, This is what happens when control replaces connection. When truth is buried under perfection. When a family's love is tested not by tragedy, but by truth. By the time the season reached its end, the confrontation had done more than expose secrets. It had rewritten how the Plaths saw themselves. Mariah had stopped trying to fix her mother. Ethan had stopped trying to understand her. Barry had stopped trying to save her. They were finally learning how to live without her control. In one of the last scenes, Barry summed it up best. "I think she believed control was love, but now we know love isn't control." Sarah's tone softens as the music fades beneath her words. That's the tragedy of the Plath family. Not the secrets, not the lies, but the years lost to silence. The years spent believing control was care, when it was really fear. Kim's absence now felt permanent. Even if she returned, she could never be who she once was. The children's trust was gone, and Barry's heart was too heavy to rebuild. And as viewers watched that final scene, Barry standing alone in the kitchen where family dinners once echoed, it became painfully clear. The marriage had been more than a relationship. It had been a system, and without Kim's control, the system collapsed. Sarah's closing line of the act. For the first time in decades, the Plath family wasn't living in Kim's world anymore. They were standing in reality, messy, painful, but finally honest. Then her voice drops to a whisper, leaving the audience on edge. But honesty comes with a cost. And the next chapter of this family's story would show just how high that cost would be. It started quietly, the way most collapses do. Not with shouting or chaos, but with absence. With the sound of people finally walking away. For years, Kim Plath had been the center of her family's world. The voice of authority, the guardian of purity, the architect of the life they lived. But by the time this chapter began, that power had evaporated. Her family was no longer orbiting her. They were drifting out into their own lives, and the distance was irreversible. The cameras caught it all. The way Barry's eyes had changed, soft but defeated. The way Mariah stopped looking for her mother's approval. The way Micah began saying out loud what everyone else had only thought. Sarah's voice draws us into that moment. This is what the fall looks like. Not rage or revenge, but recognition. When people stop believing the story they've been told and start living their own truth. Kim's public image, once spotless, started to crumble. Online discussions shifted from admiration to confusion. Viewers who had once defended her were now questioning her motives. Clips resurfaced from the early seasons. Kim lecturing her kids about modesty, lecturing Barry about control, crying about the pain of disobedience. But now, those same scenes looked different. They didn't look like faith anymore. They looked like control. And suddenly, the internet began connecting dots that had always been there. Barry, the once silent husband, began showing up in interviews. His tone was different now, still kind, still soft-spoken, but tinged with something new. Honesty. He told producers, "I used to think she was just trying to protect us, but maybe she was protecting herself." Sarah pauses after the line, letting the emotion sink in. That's what makes this so heartbreaking. Barry didn't hate Kim. He pitied her. He saw what fear had done to her, and to all of them. Mariah's transformation was perhaps the most striking. Once the rebellious daughter, she was now the one speaking truth with calm authority. In an interview, she said, "My mom taught me that love has limits, but real love doesn't need control." Those words went viral. Fans called her brave. Others called it healing. But for Kim, it was a public unraveling. Micah, meanwhile, was finally thriving, modeling, traveling, and speaking openly about what it meant to grow up in a house ruled by fear. "When you're told what to think for so long," he said, "freedom feels like confusion at first. Then it starts to feel like breathing," Sarah adds softly. You could see it in his smile. Freedom looks good on someone who's had to earn it. Kim, however, was nowhere to be found. No interviews, no social media posts. Her silence became its own statement. Producers reached out to her multiple times. The only response came through a brief message. I'm focusing on healing and my relationship with God. But that message did little to stop the speculation. Viewers wondered what she was healing from, and what she might still be hiding. Sarah's commentary sharpens, turning reflective. This wasn't just about a marriage falling apart. It was about a system collapsing. The rules, the isolation, the righteousness, all of it had been built to hold something fragile together. But once the truth came out, the foundation cracked. The family home, that iconic farm once shown as the symbol of order and discipline, sat mostly empty now. The children who once feared the outside world had left it behind. The land that once represented purity now felt haunted by secrets. Barry walked those empty halls like a man searching for a ghost. In one of the most haunting scenes of the season, Barry stands in the kitchen, hands in his pockets, staring at the old family photos on the wall. The kids are laughing in those pictures, frozen in time, still believing everything they were told. He whispers, almost to himself, "I thought we were doing the right thing." Sarah narrates over the moment. That's the tragedy of control. It convinces you that fear is love, that silence is safety, that obedience is faith. But in the end, control doesn't protect. It isolates. The emotional fallout spread like quiet wildfire. Lydia, still loyal and gentle, tried to bridge the gap between her parents. She prayed, sent messages, tried to remind everyone of forgiveness. But even she began to understand something that faith alone couldn't fix. In one tender interview, Lydia said, "I still love my mom. But love doesn't mean pretending nothing happened." Those words captured the entire family's pain, the collision between love and truth. As Kim's absence grew longer, her image began to disintegrate. What had once been viewed as devotion now looked like deflection. What was once faithfulness now looked like performance, and slowly, the story shifted from the perfect Christian family to the cautionary tale of what happens when faith becomes control, and control becomes identity. Sarah's tone grows somber, steady. Kim didn't fall because she was evil. She fell because she built her life on a lie she thought she could live inside forever. But lies don't make good homes. They rot from the inside until everything collapses. Mariah stopped visiting entirely. Ethan moved further away. Micah distanced himself. Even Lydia began attending events without mentioning her mother. Every family member found their own kind of freedom. But freedom came with grief. Because when you've lived under control for that long, even breathing feels guilty at first, Sarah adds. The saddest part is that Kim could have had everything she wanted. Love, faith, a family who adored her, if she had only trusted them enough to be honest. Fans online started comparing the Plaths' unraveling to other reality TV families who fell apart under the weight of secrets. But there was something unique about this story. This wasn't about fame or money. This was about belief. About how someone can believe their own lie so completely that it becomes reality, until reality fights back. Then came the footage that broke hearts everywhere. Barry sitting alone at church, head bowed, ring still on his finger. The camera stayed on him for nearly a minute as he whispered a quiet prayer. We couldn't hear the words, but we didn't need to. His face said everything. Sarah's narration slows to a near whisper. Barry had spent his life following a woman he thought was leading him to God. But in the end, she was only leading him away from himself. The music swells as she continues. He wasn't angry. He wasn't vengeful. He was heartbroken. Because sometimes the cruelest truth isn't that someone lied to you. It's realizing you never really knew them at all. Retention line. Once the truth comes out, there's no way back to innocence. By the end of the season, the Plath family had scattered, physically and emotionally, each of them searching for identity, for meaning, for the kind of truth they were denied for so long. And Kim? She was gone. Not missing, just gone. Somewhere out there, living another version of the truth she once hid from. Barry, meanwhile, stood at a crossroads. He'd lost the marriage, the home, and the illusion of the woman he thought he loved. But he had gained something new. Perspective. He was finally asking the question that would haunt him for the rest of his life. As the camera faded to black, his voice echoed softly, half prayer, half confession. I thought I knew her. But maybe I only knew the version she wanted me to see. Sarah's final words of the act land with quiet finality. And that's the hardest truth of all. Realizing that the person you built your world around was never really there. The screen darkens. The music fades. End on cliffhanger. Barry lifts his eyes toward the empty doorway of the home they once shared, the silence swallowing him whole. And for the first time, he asks the question out loud. Did I ever really know the woman I married? The silence after the fall wasn't peace, it was aftermath. The kind of stillness that comes when the dust finally settles and you see what's been destroyed. For the Plaths, the reckoning wasn't about revenge or punishment. It was about facing the truth, all of it. Every hidden piece of Kim's story, every wound that control had left behind. This was no longer a show about a perfect Christian family. It was a story about survival after deception. Barry's transformation became the emotional backbone of this chapter. He had always been the quiet one, the follower, the gentle father who moved in Kim's shadow. But now, with that shadow gone, something inside him began to shift. In a raw interview, he said softly, "You spend so many years following rules, you forget what it's like to think for yourself. I'm learning that faith isn't control, it's trust. And I have to learn how to trust again." Sarah's tone turns introspective. That's what reckoning really is. Not anger, not payback, but realization. The moment you stop waiting for the past to make sense and start accepting that it never will. Barry began reconnecting with his children, not as the patriarch of a strict home, but as a father trying to make things right. One moment stood out, a quiet dinner with Mariah and Micah. No cameras, no sermons, just awkward laughter and hesitant conversation. Barry said, "I don't know how to be the dad you needed before, but I'm trying to be that now." Mariah smiled for the first time in a long time. Sarah adds softly, "Healing doesn't start with answers. It starts with accountability." Meanwhile, Mariah took her pain and turned it into expression. She began writing songs again, raw, emotional pieces about identity, control, and freedom. One song, titled "Cage Made of Faith," became a quiet anthem for fans who had lived through similar family control. In one lyric, she explained in an interview, without singing it, she said faith is supposed to be light. But when it becomes a wall, you're not worshiping God anymore. You're worshiping fear. That line hit hard. It wasn't rebellion anymore. It was revelation. Ethan and Olivia, who had kept their distance for months, began speaking out too. They didn't do it out of spite, but clarity. Ethan said, "You don't realize how much power your parents' version of truth has over you until you start questioning it. And once you do, you can't unsee it." Olivia added, "We tried to love her through it. But you can't love someone into honesty." Those words spread like wildfire across social media, echoing a theme that had become impossible to ignore. This wasn't a story about faith. It was a story about control disguised as faith. Kim, however, was finally forced to face her own reckoning. For weeks, producers and journalists tried to reach her. offering her a platform to set the record straight. Eventually, she agreed to one brief recorded conversation, not in a studio, but in a small rented space. When the footage aired, it stunned everyone. Kim looked smaller, quieter, her confidence replaced by caution. She didn't deny the past, but she didn't admit it either. Instead, she spoke in riddles. We all make choices. We all carry pain. Sometimes the only way to survive is to become someone else for a while. Sarah's commentary cuts in immediately. She didn't confess. She didn't explain. She deflected. Because reckoning isn't about what you admit out loud. It's about what you can no longer hide from yourself. That clip of Kim became symbolic. For fans, it was confirmation that she wasn't ready to face the truth. But for her family, it was closure. The silence that followed wasn't fear. It was acceptance. Lydia, in her quiet strength, summed it up best. I used to pray for my mom to come back. Now I pray for her to find peace, even if that means we're apart. Sarah's voice softens, heavy with emotion. Forgiveness doesn't always mean reunion. Sometimes it means letting go before the pain defines you. Barry's reckoning came in one of the most powerful scenes ever filmed for the series. He walked through the old Plathville property, the empty rooms, the school books still stacked neatly on shelves, the dance studio Kim once built, now silent and still. He stood in the middle of that empty space, sunlight spilling through the windows, and whispered, "This used to be her world." He paused, eyes glistening. But it was never mine. Sarah's narration rises, steady and clear. That's the moment Barry stopped being a background character in his own life. The moment he realized that freedom isn't walking away, it's finally standing still in the truth. The children's lives began branching in different directions, but the emotional thread connecting them remained, the need to understand what they came from without being trapped by it. Micah said in one interview, "We can't change who raised us, but we can change what we carry forward." That sentiment became the heart of the reckoning. This family wasn't broken beyond repair. They were rebuilding, not around Kim's control, but around honesty. But for viewers, one question lingered. What exactly had Kim been hiding all along? Rumors swirled again. Old records, old friends, old stories resurfaced. The whispers about Jennifer Albright, the name that had appeared in a buried ID, reappeared in online threads. Sarah handles it with care, her tone journalistic but restrained. The evidence pointing to Kim's double identity was never confirmed on air. But what mattered wasn't the name. It was the pattern, reinvention, control, erasure. She pauses. If she truly had been living under an assumed past, that secret had already done its damage. The reckoning wasn't legal, it was emotional. Then came the most devastating revelation of all, from Barry himself. In an emotional confessional filmed months later, he said, "I found letters in the attic. From people I'd never met. They were written to her under a different name." He looked down, voice trembling. "That's when I knew the truth. She had a whole life before me, and she never wanted me to know." The room fell silent. Even the producer behind the camera didn't speak. Sarah's commentary fades in like a heartbeat. That was it. The final piece of the puzzle. Not a crime. Not a scandal. Just a woman so desperate to bury her past that she buried her family with it. The reckoning wasn't loud. It wasn't televised confrontation or public scandal. It was private, quiet, deeply human. The kind of reckoning that happens when the lies stop echoing and all that's left is truth. Raw, painful, undeniable. Barry summed it up in one sentence. You can forgive someone without forgetting what they did. Sarah's closing narration rises above soft piano music. This family began as a picture of perfection, a world of rules, smiles, and sanctity. But the truth behind that picture was control, fear, and secrecy. And when those walls finally fell, what remained wasn't destruction. It was freedom. She pauses. Kim built a world that couldn't survive honesty. Barry and the kids are learning to live in one that can. Retention line. The reckoning wasn't the end. It was the beginning of truth. The final image of the act is simple. Barry standing outside the old Plath farm, watching the sunset behind the trees. He isn't looking back anymore. He's just standing there, steady, present, free. Sarah's voice fades out with one last haunting question. When a life built on lies finally collapses, what's left to save? The truth or the people who lived inside it? When the cameras stopped rolling and the world moved on to the next story, the Plaths were left with silence, the kind that forces you to face what's real. For the first time, there were no production lights, no posed family shots, no carefully rehearsed smiles. Just a house that felt too big, a history that felt too heavy, and a family scattered across new lives that they were still learning to trust. The aftermath wasn't dramatic. It was slow, raw, and full of moments that never made it on screen. Barry was the first to admit that he didn't know what came next. He said in one quiet interview, "I spent years believing our life was about faith and discipline. Now I see it was about control, and I let it happen." That confession hit harder than any revelation that came before. It wasn't about Kim anymore. It was about accountability, about a man realizing how silence can enable destruction. Sarah's voice steadies the narrative. Barry's story is the kind of redemption that doesn't make headlines. It's quiet, it's personal, and it's built one small, humble act at a time. Barry began rebuilding his relationships with the kids the way you rebuild trust after a storm, slowly, with honesty. There were no grand gestures, just presence. Calls that used to last minutes began stretching into hours. Texts that used to feel formal turned warm. He spent weekends visiting Micah, who had moved away to focus on modeling and independence. Cameras caught snippets of those visits. Simple scenes of a father helping his son move furniture, or cooking breakfast together, laughing over burnt toast. For viewers who had watched this family through years of stiffness, it felt like a breakthrough. Mariah, meanwhile, was still wrestling with her pain. She said in an interview, "Forgiving my mom doesn't mean forgetting what happened. It means I won't let her choices control who I become." Sarah reflects softly. That's the kind of strength people mistake for rebellion. But it's really healing. Ethan and Olivia were finding their footing too. They spent a long stretch away from both families, trying to define their marriage outside the chaos. Olivia once posted, "Growth is painful, but it's more painful to stay the same." Fans read that and felt the ache between her lines, a reminder that healing rarely happens in harmony. Ethan visited Barry again on camera after a long time apart. The scene was tense at first, years of silence and hurt standing between them. Barry offered him coffee, his hands shaking slightly, and said, "I wasn't there when I should have been. I can't change that. But I can be here now." Ethan nodded slowly. "That's all I wanted, Dad," Sarah adds. "That's what forgiveness looks like when it's real. Awkward, hesitant, but full of heart." Retention line. Even when the cameras fade, the truth still echoes, because healing doesn't stop when the story ends. Then there was Lydia, the quiet soul of the Plath family. Through the turmoil, she remained the bridge between everyone, still soft-spoken, but no longer naive. She once said, "I used to think love meant doing everything right. Now I know it means staying when things are wrong." She continued to live at home part-time, helping Barry and staying grounded in faith. but her faith had changed. It wasn't fear-based anymore. It was gentle, reflective, and real. She sang hymns with new meaning, sometimes in small church gatherings, her voice trembling but sure. Sarah narrates with tenderness. Lydia didn't reject her upbringing. She redeemed it. And what about Kim? Her presence faded from the public eye. She stopped appearing in family photos and social posts. Some say she moved quietly. Others say she stayed close but distant. There were whispers of reconciliation attempts, but nothing solid ever surfaced. Barry once said, "I wish her peace." That's all. It wasn't bitterness. It was release. The same kind of release that comes after you've spent years holding on to a story that never belonged to you. Sarah's tone deepens. Sometimes closure isn't a conversation. It's acceptance that you may never get one. Fans of Welcome to Plathville felt the shift too. The show was no longer about an isolated family trying to preserve an image. It had become a reflection of something more universal, the moment when illusion collapses and truth demands to be seen. The audience grew quieter, but more thoughtful. Comment sections that once buzzed with outrage turned reflective. One viewer wrote, "Watching Barry learn to listen to his kids is the most healing thing I've seen on reality TV." Sarah smiles softly in narration. When viewers start seeing themselves in the pain, that's when storytelling becomes transformation. As months passed, the Plath family began redefining what togetherness meant. Family dinners weren't mandatory, they were chosen. Conversations weren't scripted, they were messy and real. Mariah once said, "We're not perfect." We never were. But at least now we're honest. Those words summed up everything. The show had started with perfection as a mask. It ended with truth as the new foundation. Barry's face, older and lined, carried the quiet resilience of a man who had walked through fire and made peace with the ashes. He said during one finale scene, "You don't lose faith when you lose control. You lose fear." And that single sentence reframed everything the audience thought they knew. Sarah's commentary carries emotional weight here. This isn't a story about villains or victims anymore. It's about what happens when truth collides with image, and love survives anyway. The beauty of the aftermath wasn't in the resolution. It was in the courage to keep moving forward despite everything. Mariah started performing publicly again. Micah took his career more seriously. Lydia found her calling in mentoring others through faith transitions. Ethan and Olivia continued to redefine their relationship boundaries. And Barry, he stayed steady, present, open. No one returned to the life they had before, but none of them wanted to. Retention line. Freedom doesn't always look like happiness. Sometimes it looks like peace after chaos. The final moments of this act feel intimate. Sarah's voice softens into reflection. When you strip away control, appearances, and fear, what's left is the real version of a family. Flawed, broken, but trying. She pauses. That's what made this story powerful. Not the scandal. Not the secrets. But the courage to start over without pretending anymore. A montage of the family's separate lives plays. Mariah laughing with friends. Micah driving to a photo shoot. Lydia praying quietly by a window. Ethan and Olivia walking through a quiet town street. Barry tending the old garden. Each scene feels like a small heartbeat, a reminder that healing isn't loud. It's steady. Sarah closes the act with one final, heartfelt message to the audience. Maybe that's why Welcome to Plathville still resonates so deeply. Because beneath all the rules and heartbreak, it was never really about control. It was about people trying to find truth in a world that rewards illusion. She pauses for breath, her voice soft but sure. And maybe that's what makes their story, and ours, worth watching. Retention line: the Plaths lost their image, but they found their truth. And sometimes, that's the only kind of redemption that lasts. The camera fades out on the old Plath home once more. The front porch empty, the windows reflecting the sky. No more sermons, no more secrets. Just quiet. Sarah's final line brings everything home. Because when you spend years pretending to be someone you're not, the bravest thing you can ever do is finally stop pretending, fade to black,